on the Romans Education Part 2, and this is Session 5A. I'm saying A because I already know this is going to be divided into two parts. This is Easter Sunday. It's not going to be an Easter message, but I do want to say that I realize this is Easter Sunday, and I certainly realize the importance of the resurrection. About 45 years ago, I was on church staff at a church in Shreveport, Louisiana, and I needed a car, and the pastor of the church knew of a guy. He was from Mississippi. He knew of a guy in Mississippi that he had bought his cars from, and other folks had bought cars from. And so he kind of lined it up where I could go over there and buy a car from this guy and drive it back. So I flew over to Mississippi, and the guy that owned the car lot's name was J.D. Couture. Anyway, I asked the preacher, I said, so how will I know this guy? How will he know me to pick me up at the airport? He said, you'll know him. I said, okay. So I got over to the airport and flew in and got off the plane, and I was looking around at people, and then here was a guy that was also kind of looking around. He figured maybe that's it, and so he walked up to me and he said, what is the single greatest event in the history of the world? First words out of his mouth. And I thought for a second, and I wanted to say, are you JD? But but when he asked me that question, I thought for a second, and I said, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he put his hand out and he went, J.D. Couture, glad to meet you. And it made me think, what if I had got that wrong? You know, would he have acted like, I don't know you? Anyway, so, and I say that just to illustrate that the resurrection is the greatest event in the history of the world. That's not to minimize any of the other things that God has done. But look, if there is no resurrection, then our faith is in vain. And so the resurrection was an absolute necessity, and so we rejoice in that. And this is the day that everybody is celebrating that. And so what we're going to do, and by matter of fact, at the beginning of in your new book, we're in that next book now, and if you'll turn over to your note takers there, you're going to see a timeline right off the bat. And also, not only in that new book, but today, because I got to looking at what was in that book, I became dissatisfied about not putting something in there. So after the fact, I put together 10 more pages. That's what you have stapled and in front of you here. For those of you that are on Zoom, Larry would have sent those out in an email, and if you didn't get those, I hope that you'll look over there and get those. If you have a chance to print them out quickly, then to do that. Some of that is going to be very germane to the note takers in this addendum. Some of it is going to be reservoir of knowledge material. I'll show you that as we kind of go through it. But what I've done is given you a little more detail about a timeline that's actually sitting in your book. And I'm going to just show you this. This is what it looks like in your book. When I put this timeline together, there was only one major issue that I was trying to get done, and so I kind of just briefed through this little timeline. But there's a couple of things that I need to do. First of all, the more I looked at that, the more I wish I had included some other things in there, just for informational purposes. And not that we're going to spend a lot of time studying those things today, but I thought that information would be really valuable if you had it all together in one outline instead of look up two or three and trying to figure out which one was which. This would be the easy way to do it. The second thing is I got a couple of things I need to tweak on the outline that's in your book. For me, sometimes it is easy to kind of get lost in the shuffle of all the numbers of the things that I'm doing. So I'm going to make a couple of corrections to this as we go down through there, but you'll see that as we work through. And so what I did at the end of the notes that I have handed out to you today or if you're on Zoom, the notes that were given to you, you have a very similar timeline printed on those notes, and those corrections have been made. So if at the end of the day you want to figure out which one is which, just look at the one you're going to that I gave you in the addendum. That has everything exactly the way that it ought to be. I'll show you the couple of places that it corrects the timeline that's in your book. And you might want to go ahead and correct that in the book, because that's the one that's always going to be in there bound. Because I have the machine at home, I was able to take my addendum and just slip it into my book. And but for you, it's just going to be those pages that have been stapled together. And so right off the bat, once again, let me make a correction to the addendum notes. Let me make an addendum to the addendum. Lord have mercy. So anyway, I tell you what, I'll make that as we get to it rather than me just jumping you over there now. Let's work our way through this. So this is session 5A. We're going to be talking about the edification offices and the operations in connection with those. Remember, in our last session, we were looking a little bit at the offices of bishop and deacon. One of the things that we want to do in this session is I want to take a look at the transition into the supernatural gifts at the beginning of this dispensation of grace, and then the transition out of those gifts into the offices that we would be accustomed to today. And I just want to make sure that we understand the terminology. When I talk about the gifts, when Paul talks about in Romans 12, when he talks about the gifts, these are those supernatural abilities that were given by God, and the Spirit decided who got what. Now, as for the office, the normal way of thinking about an office is some kind of little room where you work. And I want to talk to you about some other definitions of office. In fact, whenever someone says, I'm going to the office, because that's where they work, that's not even the number one definition of office in the Oxford English Dictionary. I thought that was interesting. So let's walk through this and take a look at it. First of all, the word office, the number one definition is something done toward anyone, a service, kindness, attention. And when you look at that as the number one definition, that's a perfect example of what Paul is talking about in Romans 12 when he talks about an office. By the way, we're going to come back to this definition when we get a little further in to the next form of doctrine, because this is perfect. Anyway, again, we'll do that in just a bit. Here's the number two definition. I'm sorry, there's an added sentence to that. It says, chiefly with qualification as good, kind office, office of kindness. I might as well just go ahead and mention it now, and I'll bring it up again. If you don't remember it, it won't be a big deal. I'll bring it up again later. Because remember what the first core feature of godly love was? Thank you. So that first core feature of godly love was selflessness. And when we get into the second core feature, which we're going to get starting in verses 9 and 10 in Romans chapter 12, it's going to be godly loving kindness. You know what? Because I know that, take a look again at the definition. Something done toward anyone, a service, kindness. There's that word. And now look at this. This is exactly what's in the Oxford English Dictionary. Look at that sentence in red on the PowerPoint. Chiefly with qualification. In other words, this office is described chiefly as good, kind office, office of kindness. I thought that was remarkable, because that is going to be the second core feature of godly love that's going to be installed in us by Romans chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. But I'll remind you about that when we get over there, and you'll kind of see a connection to that. For now, what we're doing is we're defining the word office. At the very core of what an office is a kind service towards someone else. I thought that was pretty remarkable. Okay. Definition number 2. That which one ought or has to do in the way of service. That which is required or expected. Here's, that's 2A. Here's 2B. Duty toward others. Here's 2B. It says, I'm sorry, that was 2A, and now 2B. Duty attached to one's station. In parenthesis, this is my adding this. Our station as a member of the body of Christ. And then it goes on to say in the Oxford English Dictionary, a service or task to be performed, business, function, one's part. Do you what you realize in all these first definitions, he's not talking about some room in a building with a window that you're looking out. He's not talking about, that's not the way office is understood in his first several definitions. But these all circle around the fact of service or duty to be performed toward someone else. And so it's these definitions that we should have in our mind when we're talking about filling an office as members of this body. We're going to be laboring in our Father's business. Look at that 2B definition. Duty attached to one's station. A service or task to be performed. You know what I think of when I think of that? A duty or service to be performed. I think about the measure of faith that was given to all of us. The next word in there, a duty or task to be performed, business. You know what I think of when I think of that? Our Father's business. This is what we're supposed to be involved in. Function, one's part. That's perfect, because we're part of a body. It's the part that we have to play in the function of the whole. This definition really fits in with everything that we've been looking at so far. And so now what I'd like to do is turn your attention to that timeline in the addendum. In other words, just go to page 1 in the addendum. And there's a couple of things that I want us to look at over there. And kind of, you have a couple of things to fill in, and I have a couple of corrections to make. You know, when it comes to studying about Israel, when you're talking about time, there are some oddities with them that do not happen with us. They're kind of different. Let me give you a couple of examples. In Israel's, for the Hebrew people, when you go back and you look at things in the Bible, their day starts at 6 o'clock p.m., and that's called evening. And that runs from 6 to 9. And then from 9 to 12, that's called midnight. And then from 12 to 3, that's called cockcrow. And then from 3 to 6, that's called morning. And then after that, the day is broken down into hours. So from 6 to 7, that is the first hour of the day. 7 to 8, of course, would be the second hour of the day. That's a little bit different, isn't it? In fact, when you're trying to sort out, when the Bible's talking about this happening on a day, you have to understand that the Sabbath day started at 6 o'clock the evening before. And just like the Bible starts out, remember, we do this. We do morning and evening. But you remember how the Bible does it? Evening and morning. It's like that from the very creation. And so for the Hebrew people, their day kind of runs like this. It's kind of an oddity, and so you kind of have to pay attention to that. Also, another oddity is that the Jews had 2 calendars. They had a civil year, and they had a religious year. And those started with different months. And so when you're looking at what month, you have to know which calendar they're actually talking about so that you can identify it in the year, if you have an interest in doing that. And so when you're talking about time, there's another oddity with regard to that. Yes. Jesus says one time, he was being asked a question, he said, are there not 12 hours in a day? And someone might look at that and say, wait a minute, there's 24 hours in a day. But he's not talking about the whole cycle of the day. He's talking about beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning and running until 6 o'clock in the evening. That would be considered the day. Okay. So, anyway, now what we have is, when we're talking about time, there's some other oddities, so to speak. We have little colloquialisms that describe periods of time, but they're not very specific. For instance, when someone wants to talk about something and haven't seen somebody for a long time, they would say, I haven't seen them in a month of Sundays. But that's not a very precise way. They're not trying to give you an exact amount of time. What are they trying to say? It's just been a long time. Because you'd say a month of Sundays would be 30 weeks, right? Unless the day is January, then it'd be 31 weeks. Unless it was February, then it'd be 28 weeks. Unless it was a leap year, then it'd be 29 weeks. I mean, I'm just saying it's not exact. But it's to just say that. There's another thing that we say, and that is, boy, that only happens once in a blue moon. I used to wonder, what in the world is a blue moon? A blue moon is the second full moon in the same calendar month. Doesn't happen every year, but it happens this year, August the 22nd. We get that second, and by the way, we get one again next year. It's kind of an anomaly, get two in a row. But anyway, that just, again, that's just something that says it's been a long time. But when you talk about the Jews and all of that, they're more precise. I was mentioning to you just a while ago, February has 28 days. On a leap year, it has 29 days. A lot of the months have 30, and a lot of them have 31, so it's not very exact. But here's the way it worked in Israel's program. All the days of the month had 30 days. And they didn't do a leap year where they added a day. What they did is they went a longer period of time, and they added another 30-day month. So everything stayed 30 all the way through. Now, why is that important? Because that really does allow for some precision in their terminology. So just like we may use those phrases that aren't very exact, once in a blue moon, or, you know, I haven't seen him in a month of Sundays, or anything like that, the Jews also had phrases that they used, but they were precise. They used these. I don't think I put it on the PowerPoint, so let me just write it up. They had a normal week, which they understood to be 7 days. We get that, 7 days in a week. But the Bible, remember that phrase I gave you a while ago, month of Sundays? You know what did we understand that to be? 30 weeks, so to speak. I mean, it's just basically a long time. But the Jews come along, and they would also say, this is a week of days. So a week of days was 7 days. But then they also had a week of weeks. And so the week was a substitute for the number 7. 7 days, 7 weeks. By the way, in the 7th week on the religious calendar, guess what? Israel had a feast day. It's called the Feast of Weeks. I mean, wouldn't it? Sure. It's called the Feast of Weeks. And certain things were done during that. And so what that is that's 7 sevens of days, or that would be 49 days. And you know what comes after that? Pentecost. That's the 50th day. The Feast of Pentecost was day number 50. It came after the end of those 7 weeks. And then you also have weeks of years. So this was let me just put it up here. So this was a feast day. By the way, something happened at the end of every one of these. At the end of every 7th day, that was called a what? Yeah, that's called a Sabbath. And you know what? You took that day off. 7 weeks, that was a feast day. And by the way, you know what you did? You took that 7th week off. So if you were in the Jewish culture, then you have weeks of years. What does that mean? A week of years would be how many years? 7 years. So let's just say it this way. A week of years is 7 years. So if you had 2 weeks of years, what would you have? 14 years. Everybody gets this? And they use these phrases to actually describe, instead of saying 14 years, they would say 2 weeks of year. I mean, that was in that. And by the way, when you had a week of years, every 7 years, there was something special about that too. Because at the end, if you were a farmer, you had to let the land rest for that year, take that year off. You know what God would do if you were going to be faithful to that? Gave you a bumper crop in the 6 years, so you could get through the 7th year. So really, you got a year off. A lot of holidays in the Jewish culture. Sometimes I look at all that and I go, how did they ever show up for work? You know, when a guy got married, you remember what he was supposed to do? When he got married, he was supposed to be established in his business and established in his home and when he got married, he was supposed to take the first. Here's what the Bible says. This is really interesting. He's supposed to take the first year off to make his wife happy. Take a year off. You know what some women are saying? Please, make me happy. Go back to work, okay? You're killing me here. But week of years. And by the way, you also have 7 sevens of years. So when you have 7 sevens of years, that's 49 years, right? And you know what that was called? That was called the Jubilee. And what happened in the Jubilee year? If a guy went into servitude because he owed a debt that he couldn't pay, no matter when he went in on the Jubilee year, the debt was forgiven and he's no longer a servant. If you sold land because you needed the money in the Jubilee year, you got your land back. And you kept the money. So did it pay to know when the Jubilee was happening? Kind of did. So anyway, they have these. So here's the 3 that I'm really trying to get to. Now, I know you're wondering about this, and you're saying, what in the world does this have to do with anything? It does. I'm just trying to set this up so that when we make this trip, instead of coming in the middle of the movie, so to speak, we'll see this and follow this all the way through. So there's a standard week, which is 7 days. Then there's a week of weeks, which is 7 weeks. Then there's a week of years, which is 7 years. Now, by the way, so I'm going to give you a date. It's right at the top of your outline there. It says that in A.D., I might as well just put it up on the PowerPoint. Oh, sorry. Well, I guess I don't have it on the PowerPoint. So let me just write it up here. That first thing, not going to write them all up, but A.D. 30 is when Christ is crucified. A little bit germane, considering this is Easter Sunday. But that means it's also in AD 30 when he resurrects from the dead. I know that you're thinking, wait a minute, if he's born and he's 33 and a half years old, wouldn't that be in year 33? But you have to understand that Christ was not born in the year 1 There was no year 0. Not born in the year 1. When you actually run the dates, he is born in 4 BC, which now makes the crucifixion happen in 30 AD. If I said BC a while ago, I'm just still thinking about BC dates. In 30 AD. I know it's correct in your notes. But the next line in your notes is not accurate. It says the correct chronology places the birth of Christ in AD 33. No, he cannot be born 3 years after he's crucified. I know that that's a tough one to figure out. So I had something else going on in my head. I was trying to correct that thing about 33, and that got stuck in my head. Please replace that with this. Do you see that second sentence? The correct chronology places the birth of Christ in, here's what goes in there, 4 BC. Isn't that in your in the addendum? Right, in the addendum. It's the second line down. Please correct that AD 33 to 4 BC. It is hard to be crucified 3 years before you're born. Okay, sorry. Well, 33 AD is the date that everybody assumes because they think he's born in year 1. And I was thinking about correcting that, and so I just said the correct chronology places the birth of Christ in. I still had that in my head, and I wrote AD 33. It's 4 BC. 4 BC. The correct death is AD 30. Now, I need to show you something about that so that you understand, and this is where we're going with that. When you get to Daniel 9, look at verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. Now, I know you've heard me talk about this before, but just stick with me here for a moment. There is a commandment that was made to restore and build Jerusalem. And actually, there were several. We'll identify which one. Doesn't matter. Not going to spend a lot of time on that. But it says, unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. Now let's keep reading that passage there. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. So here's what he's saying. From the time of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem is going to be a total of 69 weeks. There's a reason he divided that up, but I wanted you to get familiar with the expression, because people act like you're just inventing something when you get over there and talk about these are weeks of years. These are weeks of years, but this fact has already been established at the start of the chapter that we're talking about years. Let me show you. If you look at the next verse, you'll see in Daniel 9:2, he says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Now, when he is given to understand the timeline for what's going to happen after what Jeremiah foretold, he comes back and he talks about 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. Well, because he's already been talking about years, then we take these to be weeks of years, or sevens of years. So the 7 weeks would be 49 years. The 62 weeks would be 434 years. And the 69 weeks would be 483 years. Now someone says, I think you're just trying to make that work. But look, if you're really going to make it weeks of days, then you know what you've just said? You've just said that from the time remember they went back. We covered all this in Ezra and Nehemiah. What you're saying is when the king gave the command to go back and to build Jerusalem, when he gave that command and rebuild, from the time he gives that command to the time that the Messiah shows up, if you say that's 69 literal weeks, do you know how many weeks are in a year? So how many weeks, what are we talking about here? We're talking about basically 14 months. So you're telling me that from the time they gave the command until the Messiah was cut off on the cross was 14 months. That will not work. And if you make it weeks of weeks, if you say it's 7 weeks of weeks and 62 weeks of weeks, you still don't have enough time. The math will force you to go to weeks of years. And that works perfectly. And you don't have to do anything else with that. By the way, the context will help you determine that. Do you remember later in the book of Daniel where he says, I was fasting for 3 full weeks. Which of those do you think he was talking about? Do you think he was talking about a literal week? Or do you think he was talking about weeks of weeks? Or do you think he was talking about weeks of years? He was talking about 21 days. I mean, the context has to make sense. So you can't make the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, if you're going to have any common sense, you can't, between the commandment and the Messiah being cut off, you can't make those literal weeks. All right, so here we go. So let me just kind of put this together, because if you say it, doesn't matter. It's all in your notes. So anyway, here's the thing. When was that command given? Let me give it to you here. The command was given, and it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king. Cut it off there. You can go over and read the chapter for yourself. We've actually read this whole chapter, verse by verse, before. But when you go down and look at that, the rest of this chapter describes the command that's being given to Nehemiah to go back and to rebuild. And we're told in verse 1 when this happens. In the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king. And when was the 20th year of Artaxerxes? The 20th year of Artaxerxes is 454 BC. I know almost every single commentary says that it is 445 BC. And you're going to say, does that make a difference? It does. And I know why they call it 445. So I've given you a little bit of a timeline with an explanation here in this addendum. The 20th year of Artaxerxes was 454. By the way, when Daniel receives this vision, who is the vision concerning? Did I hear Ruby say Israel? Is that what you said? Okay, well, that's what you should have said. Okay, because that's it. That's right. The vision concerns Israel. And so here's what you have, is you have Artaxerxes. Look, who was Artaxerxes' father? Xerxes. And his father, Xerxes, becomes king over Persia in 486. Look, some of you on Zoom, if your eyes are starting to roll back in your head and you're about to slip into a coma, just stick with me for a minute. This is important, and it's not difficult. Just stick with me. Artaxerxes' father, Artaxerxes the one that gave the command. That's when the clock starts ticking. So his father was Xerxes. He became king of Persia in 486 BC. In 474, he made Xerxes, his son, pro-rex, which means he made him a co-regent along with him. But he didn't give Artaxerxes everything in Persia. You know what he made Artaxerxes ruler over? The land of Israel. Oh, Linda, you had something here? Oh, okay. Xerxes made his son Artaxerxes. Sorry. Okay, thank you for catching that. Xerxes makes his son Artaxerxes pro-rex in 474. You know what that means? In the 12th year of Xerxes, he makes his son co-regent along with him. And what is he co-regent over? He's co-regent over the Jews in the land of Israel. And folks, that is what starts the 20-year count. In Artaxerxes' 20th year as king over the land of Israel. Now here's what's going to happen. In 465 BC, the father, Xerxes, dies in the 21st year of his reign. And guess what happens then? His son Artaxerxes becomes not pro-rex, but he becomes sole rex. He is now king of everything, and he is king alone. The co-regent thing is no longer enforced because now his father is dead. And so in 454 BC, Artaxerxes is in the 10th year of his reign. But what did Nehemiah say? He gave that command in the 20th year of his reign. And if you count that 20th year, that is 454 BC. So where does everybody get the 445 date? They wait until he becomes sole rex, and then they start the 20-year count from there. And if you do that, you have just messed up the whole chronology about the birth of Christ and the death on the cross and all of that stuff. The prophecy no longer works. The 70-year prophecy no longer works if you go from 445 BC. Now, I've watched a lot of people go through a lot of mathematical shenanigans to try to make it work because they realize there's a problem with it. They just missed one simple issue, and that is that Artaxerxes becomes pro-rex over the land of Israel 20 years before 454 BC. That's what you need to understand. Now, if you look back at that addendum, you're going to see that I have some years there. So here's what you have. He becomes 454, he gives that commandment, right? And so what's going to happen is, a year later, you're in BC here. So you're counting down. So in 453, that's a year after he gave that. This is easy. Look, 452, that's the second year. 451, that's the third year. Please tell me I don't need to put them all up. Don't we see how this is working? So what I did in your notes is I put some arrows down to take you to the year 1 BC. And so 1 BC is going to be 400. Well, I swapped them, didn't I? 453. The reason I put that in there is because now we move to 1 AD, which means if you're just doing math, you have to subtract 1 because there is no year 0. So you go from 1 BC immediately to 1 AD, and guess what? In 1 AD, 454. Now, again, that would mean year 2, 455. Year 3, 456. We got it? Got it? So we're counting up these years. When you get to 30 AD, guess where you are? You're at 483. That's the crucifixion, 30 AD. Remember the first thing on your timeline, crucified in 30 A.D. Do you know what Daniel said? 80 years before the commandment was given. 80 years before Artaxerxes gave this command, Daniel was given the prophecy that from the time the commandment was given to the time the Messiah was cut off was going to be 69 weeks of years, or 483 years. And guess what? It was exactly to the year. That's why you can't go with the 445 BC date, because it won't work. Now, why am I telling you that? Because then, if you look at number 10 on your list there, Jesus comes into the city of Jerusalem to be declared prince or king on the 10th day of Nisan in the year AD 30. On the 14th of Nisan, he is crucified. On the 17th of Nisan, he is resurrected. According to Luke 3, he begins his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius. The historians have a time with this one too. Do you know why? Because they don't realize that in 12 A.D., Tiberius became co-regent with Caesar Augustus, just like Artaxerxes became co-regent with Xerxes. It's the same issue. This is the stumbling stone for the historians. Their chronology gets off in both places, and they just, you know what most of these guys do? They just go, the Bible's not trying to give us any exact dates here, this just won't work. But when you understand the co-regent issue happened not only with Artaxerxes and Xerxes, but also with Tiberius and Augustus, now you realize that in the 15th year of Augustus, you know where you land? I mean, just take a look at the notes there. In 15 A.D., that's 5. In 26, look. Remember number 11, Jesus began his public ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius. What was the 15th year of Tiberius? Look at that outline. See, it says 26 A.D. That's the 15th year of Tiberius. And guess what? Jesus was baptized and tempted in the wilderness. And you know what? But that year, 26 A.D., is almost over. So you have 26 A.D. All you have left of that year, when Jesus is baptized by John and is tempted in the wilderness for 40 days, that is the last quarter of the year. In other words, in about 3 months, now you're no longer in 26, you're in 27. It should be the last quarter. Thanks for catching that. Yeah, please correct that. It says the first quarter year. It's the last, thank you, last quarter year. So in year 27, that's the first full year of Jesus' ministry. Anybody knows how long his ministry was in total? 3.5 years. So in 27, you've got the first full year, 28, the second full year, 29, the third full year. And when you get to, and so far, the total so far is 3.25 years. Then when you get to AD 30, you have the last quarter year of his ministry. But it's the first quarter year of the month. You know, you know what? I think I wrote first quarter year because I was talking about his ministry. But it's the last quarter of the month. Does everybody understand that? Right. And that'd be the same thing. The first quarter of the month. Yes. So Jesus is put to death in so what I'm trying to show you is in both of these timelines, they move you to the same end point, 30 A.D. All I've done here is prove to you that first thing on your timeline, that the crucifixion, the death, burial, and resurrection was in 30 A.D. Now, does that mean anything to us? Well, it does. It does. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you very quickly down this timeline, and you're going to got a couple of things to fill in that have to do, you're kidding me, that have to do with, okay, we got to get through this, that have to do with Romans chapter 12. So let's just move through this. And I'm looking at yours. Look, I'm fixing to, your addendum has things in it that are not on the timeline that's in your book. This is an expanded timeline, so I'm not going to cover everything on it, but let me just run through it. In 32 A.D., Stephen is stoned at the end of the one-year extension. Saul is converted in 32 A.D. 35 A.D., he spent 3 years in Arabia. And then in that same year, at the end, because from 32 to 35 is the 3 years. That's the end of his 3 years in Arabia. And then in 35 A.D., he also makes that first visit to Jerusalem since he has been converted. In 39 A.D., he spends, that's the end of his 4 years that he spent in Tarsus. That's from 35 to 39. And now we come to the first blank on your note taker, and that's at 41 A.D. And what goes in the blank is, right here. That is Paul's first apostolic journey. What? I have 39 on there. That's right. But it's 41. It's correct in your book. Sorry. I forgot to correct that in the PowerPoint. So I did get it in the book. I just never went back and did that. I forgot about it in the PowerPoint. So the first apostolic journey, which was 2 years in length, and what does Paul do? He goes around establishing churches. And what else is he doing when he does that? He is organizing them and ordaining elders and putting a structure to those churches so that now that he has established a church, the Spirit can give the supernatural gifts to those that are in the church to the benefit of the saints. So, again, on this, pay no attention to 39. 41 in your book is the right is the right one. As far as reservoir of knowledge goes, what I've done in this addendum is I've given you a map of that first apostolic journey, and I've given you exactly where it takes place in the Scripture. That first journey is from Acts 13:1 to Acts 14:28. I've broken that down into parts so that you can see this trip part by part. We're not going to look at that, but you can see that on your own and kind of understand what is going on. The point here, the only point here with the first thing that we fill in is that Paul is now establishing churches and ordaining elders, and now the spiritual gifts can come into use in that church, in that assembly. Then as we continue to work on down, what we find is in 43 A.D., he returns to Antioch. In 44 A.D., he makes his second visit to Jerusalem. By the way, when you get, I think I have that. Let me just look at that. Yeah, in 44 A.D., second visit to Jerusalem. That's the Council of Acts 15. Remember when there were Judaizers saying, hey, you got to keep the law? Well, Paul went down there and got all that straightened out. In 49 A.D., you have his third visit. He also goes back to Antioch in that same year. And in 49 A.D., he also has his second apostolic journey. In your notes, you get another picture of that journey, and then you get that broken down into its various parts. You can look at that at your leisure in your own notes. And now, in 49 A.D., Paul writes his epistle to the Galatians. And folks, that is the first letter of Paul's epistles that gets written. 49 A.D., the letter to the Galatians. In 51 A.D., Paul writes 1 Thessalonians. Also that year, he makes his fourth Jerusalem visit and goes back to Antioch. And then later that year, he begins his third apostolic journey. And then in 52 A.D., Paul writes 2 Thessalonians. In 54, he writes 1 Corinthians. Now, this is all in your addendum. In 55 A.D., he writes 2 Corinthians. In 57, he writes the book of Romans. In 57, he makes his fifth Jerusalem visit. And in 59 A.D., Paul goes to Rome as a prisoner. And then I've given you another map to show you that. And I've broken that down in some extra notes that are in your addendum. And then in 60 A.D., prison epistles. Paul writes Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon. In 61, he writes the book of Philippians. These are all while he is in prison. In 61 A.D., that is the end of the book of Acts. In other words, the book of Acts runs out just about at that point. And then I've got a little thing there called Paul's fourth journey. Look, I know there's a lot of debate about this. I'm not going to take time today to go into this, especially since we've already run out of time. But what I'm trying to show you here is that there was I believe there is ample evidence within God's Word to show that what happened was Paul actually had a brief period of freedom. He is imprisoned a second time and then executed. And it is during that time he writes the book of 1 Timothy. By the way, look at you'll see, in 64 A.D., Paul writes 1 Timothy and Titus. Do you remember what he said in 1 Timothy? I mean, I can pretty much quote it, but let me just read it to you. Because when you're talking about 1 Timothy, he says, because we were looking at this just the other day, if you recall. Yeah, he's right. He said, it's my desire to come and see thee shortly, but if I tarry long, and then he begins to give them that information. Why in the world would he expect to come and maybe be able to come and see Timothy? That seems a little odd thing to say if he's in prison and about to be executed. 65 A.D., Paul's second imprisonment. And here's the next thing that's really important, and this is the next thing for you to fill in on your note taker, and that is in 66 A.D., Paul writes 2 Timothy. Why is that important for you to fill in? Because that is the completion of the canon of Scripture, which means all of the spiritual gifts have now been done away with. You know what you just filled in two blanks? When they started and when they ended. They started as Paul established these churches and organized them, and they ended when everything ended when Paul completes the canon of Scripture. When that which is perfect has come, that which is in part shall be done away with. There's only one item left on the timeline, and that is in 67 A.D., Paul is executed. So, what do you have? 3 years before Titus and the Roman army comes in and sacks Jerusalem, Paul is executed. Now you have a little bit of a timeline about that, and what I tried to do is put all 13 of his epistles on that timeline that wasn't in your original timeline. This will segue us. This took longer to do than I anticipated. But what this is going to do is this is going to segue us into understanding when the spiritual gifts came into being for the Gentiles. And we're going to be looking next week at the purpose that they served. And then we're going to move that into the offices and get ourselves set up for understanding these verses in 6, 7, and 8 in Romans 12, and the offices that we're going to engage in. And this time, this is going to be some of the most exciting things that we have ever seen. Okay. Thank you for being patient and working with me through this. I think this timeline will serve us in a lot of ways down the road, but this is the end of Session 5A.